Alright, so I've taken the subframe off, cut a little bit more out of it. And when I cut out that section up here for the intake manifold, the transmission wasn't quite in the right spot. So I've moved it around and I had to cut a little bit more out, but I still got lots of room. For the engine mounts, I'd like to drop the engine a 1/4 inch or so. 3/8 before mounting it solid. Not solid, I have urethane mounts, but it's a little bit too close for my liking. So a little bit shorter, or a little bit down in the front for engine mounts. I think the transmission's right where it needs to be. Let me just scooch under here. So the gap there for the trans mount is pretty big, but I think we can manage it. I had to weld in this bar. I think I took a couple little clips of that earlier. It's like heavily tacked in right now because I'm gonna have to take it out and do a little bit of cutting. Here, let me just sit up. So kind of hard to see from this angle, but the axle, cup, and boot are pretty much touching the subframe there, and the part they're touching is not really structural at this point. I bypassed it with that tubing, and I'll try and get a shot of this. So the transmission's sitting right where it should, and I can fit my fingers underneath the axle. It's tight, but I think it's fine. The suspension's at full droop, and I might pick the transmission up the slightest bit before mounting it, so I'm happy with that. I did have to trim away. There was kind of a protection or something around the head of this nut, and I had to trim it all off because the axle was hitting it, but again, I think there's plenty of room. There's plenty of room in there now for the axle, so I'm going to pop the subframe back out and cut away where the cup and the boot reside. When tacking this in, I bolted the subframe right back to the chassis. I even bolted the control arms back in, so everything's lined up before I welded this in. Hopefully, it should be strong enough to keep this from twisting around while I work on it, because the front piece is so thin now, it's not doing a whole lot. I've already ordered longer bolts for the transmission crossmember, so hopefully they should be in tomorrow. And I'm gonna probably just make spacers out of the same material as the adapter plate because I have a whole bunch left over. But there's a comfortable gap between the pipe and the transmission, and everything looks like it's working out so far. So I'm gonna just pop the subframe back out and clean this up a bit and weld it in a bit more solid, and then cut out this chunk right there. Alright, so I didn't cut it perfectly even, but this is where the axle, like the cup and the boot, were interfering. So I had to cut that all out. You can see here where I cut, this used to stick out quite a bit more, and it was interfering with the axle. But the axle seems to have enough space now. Especially because I use hose clamps, that would have definitely hit, and the rest of it was pretty, like, way too close for comfort. I grabbed this with both hands on the table and tried flexing it. Obviously that's not a good test, but it's not floppy like it was before. So I'm gonna probably just, I think I'll probably just weld this in solid. It was just a temporary brace, but I'm confident that it's here to stay. So I'm gonna have to fabricate something to fill these gaps down here. But the rest of it's good. I'm gonna just weld all this solid and that solid. And this should be nice and sturdy. Don't know exactly what's gonna happen with the front of it yet. I still gotta figure out my oil pan and my steering rack and everything. So I'm gonna weld that up. Alright, so those obviously aren't great. I'm not the best welder. But if this piece of tube stays in the final rendition, then I'll grind those down and go over them once more and take a little bit more time to make sure that they're nice. But I'm sure they penetrated well. They just don't look pretty, but I'll grind them down just to make sure they penetrated well and go over them once more if it stays. And then I'll weld all this in to make that all one solid piece here as well. But I'm happy with that. And in the front here, I don't know if I'll put another thing through here, or I might have this. I might weld here and go out to there's a location for the U-frame bolt, but I don't have a U-frame, so I'll maybe build something to go from here to there, and that can hold the engine mount. Same on this side. It can go to the bolt position over here, and then I probably won't need this part here, and maybe I can just put a big, like another section between those two cross members up front somewhere, but we'll see. That's pretty far away. I think I got everything sitting pretty close to where it needs to end up. Obviously, hood closed. If you look in here, we still got room around the axles. I added some spacers to the transmission crossmember. There's barely any room there, but there's enough. Keep in mind this is full droop. So as long as there's something there, because it'll very rarely actually be there. There's nothing touching the transmission at the front there. It's pretty hard to tell, but I had to angle this temporary or permanent, I don't know yet, cross member to avoid the front diff section there. And if we get on the creeper, so now that we're under here, hopefully you can see what's going on. So I have, that's a piece of the 1 inch. I use 1 inch plate from the adapter plate, and I think a piece of 3/8. And the same story on the other side. And I've just kind of let the back end of the cross member droop down. My idea is to cut the bottom of the cradle here so that I can bend it up. I don't need to bend it far, and there's nothing here stopping me from doing that. I'm just gonna have to bend it so that it's within the 1 3/8, so I can just use the same spacers, because the bolts that I bought are only so long, and I don't want this hanging down as low as it is. I'll probably actually cut it further up as far as I can, right before the mounting spot for the bolt holes for the transmission mount here. Just bend this up, bolt it on, and then weld in some wedges here or something as needed. But I think it's where it needs to be. I'll try and get a shot of the drive shaft for you. It's going to be very hard to tell but it looks, yeah, this is difficult to record, but I'd say it's at a pretty decent angle. I will buy an angle finder just to, like I said, quantify what the actual angle is, because eyeballing it isn't ideal, I don't think. It does have the carrier bearing, and I feel like worst case I can maybe just raise that up an inch or so, and it might smooth this out a tiny bit more. That's gonna be all for tonight. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next part.